So governments can fail due to a number of different reasons. And the way the book defines government failure is a failure of political accountability. The idea is that if the population wants a certain policy and the government fails to deliver it, then that is a government failure. But these can come in different flavors, different varieties. So, one reason could just be economic infeasibility. It could be that the population wants everybody to be rich and everybody to be equal, and everybody to have a pony. But that might not be economically feasible, right? And so if there's not a set of policies that can get to that outcome, then there's nothing the government can do. It's not exactly a true government failure, but it does mean that the population is not getting what they want. And of course, it could mean that there are some politicians or parties that promise things that cannot be delivered. A second piece of failure could be administrative feasibility, right? And so even if a policy is economically feasible, it may not be possible in practice because the government does not have the information or capability to enact that policy. So, for example, if there is not a good way to collect taxes, then putting a tax and spending program into place isn't going to work because you're not going to be able to collect that tax revenue. If there's not a way to uh, spend the money efficiently, then you might not be able to spend on the ways that you want. And so there could be just administrative feasibility that could change over time, right? So, for instance, if we think about the income tax in the United States, it really wasn't administratively feasible in the 19th century, but came feasible in the 20th century as more and more information was collected. And then the third one is really sort of what we traditionally think of as government failure, and it's the role that special interests play. And in this case, governments might not choose to adopt policies that are feasible because of opposition by certain groups. So, for example, an increase in the minimum wage is often politically popular when it's polled, but is often not put into place, and a lot of that has to do with the special interests of employers who oppose the minimum wage because they feel it will decrease their competitiveness and or their profits. So if we think about economic infeasibility, um, in order for it to be feasible, a policy has to be a Nash equilibrium, right? And so if we, for instance, wanted to provide really generous unemployment benefits and finance those by a tax on profits, that sounds good, right? So that seems fair because people become unemployed often through no fault of their own. Tax on profit seems like a good thing. But what that's going to do is it's going to shift up the wage curve, right? Because that means that you have to pay more in order to get the same amount of effort. And it's going to shift down the price setting curve because of the extra tax on profits that decreases um, their profit, and so in order to have the same markup, the price setting curve will fall. And so instead of going from point N to point C, you end up going to point N prime in the long run, right? And so that's a place with lower real wages and higher unemployment, which is not what the population presumably wanted. And you could certainly argue that some countries do find themselves in this position with bad policies that end up with higher unemployment rates. For example, Spain, as we've seen, often has one of the higher unemployment rates in Europe, and that could be because of poor policies. That said, we have seen also that there is not a true strong relationship between unemployment benefits and the unemployment rate. And it could be that inclusive unions can raise the price setting curve by making their workers more productive, making the firms more profitable. And so then you could end up at, this point N prime by shifting up that price setting curve instead of, a point down here at N prime. And so, you know, in order to understand what really is economically feasible, we have to look at the data, right? And we have to say, all right, well, there are countries that have high unemployment benefits and a low unemployment rate. And there are also countries that have high unemployment benefits and a high unemployment rate. So what is the difference there? Why is it feasible over here and not feasible over there? And then, so inclusive unions might be one of those reasons that, a country like Finland, Denmark, Sweden can have those results, whereas a country like Spain cannot. Administrative infeasibility could arise due to a number of possibilities. Right? One could just be limited information. If you don't know who's earning the income, who's earning the profits, what the value of the land is, then you can't tax those things. If you don't know who is unemployed, who is poor, then you can't give benefits to those people. If you don't know what products and production processes are polluting the water, the air, then you can't design any appropriate policies to change that. So information is really important. It's one of the reasons that governments collect so much information, whether it's financial information or other types of information. And second could just be limited capacities, right? So you just don't have the technology or institutions in order to implement the policies or collect taxes. Um, so one of the problems, for example, in Greece has been their ability to collect taxes efficiently. Um, Another example could be educational reform, could be impossible given the teachers that you have, right? So there could be a lot of good policies that you want to put in place that work over in this country over here, but aren't going to work in this country over here just because they don't have the administrative capacity or they don't have the appropriate information. And then, of course, we could have special interests, right? So democracies hold periodic elections. In a country like the United States, we have elections every 2 years for the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate, and every 4 years for the White House. We have regular elections for governors, for state legislative bodies. Part of that could be that that gives some people a bad incentive, right? So they only focus on the next election. So they have sort of short-termism, right? We only need to worry about this election. It could also be that they need to raise money, and if they need to raise money, that gives wealthy citizens a disproportionate voice. And we've seen, especially in the federal government, the cost of House of Representative elections, or especially a Senate election, and very definitely a presidential election, have become extremely expensive. And so, in order to do that, uh, you need to make promises to the people who have money, right? And if you do that, then they're going to expect some return on those dollars, and they might have a larger say. And so that people with less money, especially the very poor, might feel like they have no voice in the government at all. So if we think about the conclusion for chapter 22, these political processes determine the institutions, right? The institutions, it's always good to think about what are the rules of the game. And those institutions determine how the pie is split. And so, a dictator might take a larger piece of the pie than governing elites, and democracy might be the best solution in terms of how those pies are split. But even a democracy is not necessarily going to be able to solve all problems, because even a really high functioning democracy will have various constraints, whether they be economic constraints, administrative constraints, or special interest constraints.